Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our call this morning. I'm Tara Rodriguez, Director of the Division of School and Program Improvement.
David Malonte, I am the Assistant Director in the division and work pretty closely with Title I Part A.
We're having a little bit of technical difficulty, so bear with us, but we're started on time, so let's go ahead and talk about some logistics for this call. If you have a question during the call about any of the information, please send that to me, and we will try to answer that during the call if possible. The webinar will be recorded and posted on the Title I Documents and Resources webpage. It's been taking us a little longer than a day or two to get those posted, but I believe that this time the stars are in alignment and we will be able to get that posted very quickly for you. Because there is some good information today that I know you're going to want to be able to review. Last month, if you recall, Bridget Stacy, who's our branch manager over 21st Century Programs, was here to talk about the provisions of that program. We also talked about Title I application revisions, and we also discussed allowable cost as well. This month, it's all about supplement, not supplant. The big news is that the non-regulatory guidance, which if you had attended some of the meetings in February, those regional meetings, that guidance was in draft at that time. We still referred to it, though. That has now been finalized, which is a really great thing because it's, states have been requesting this guidance for quite some time, and now that it's finalized, we're happy to share that with you. And when this presentation is posted, you will find links throughout the document to that guidance, so you'll be able to access that on your own. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit then about the rationale for supplement, not supplant. We'll start with just a little brief review.
So just an overview of supplement, not supplant. The rationale for the provision is to ensure that funds under Title I Part A are truly additional funds that are sort of like the cherry on the top for schools receiving those dollars, schools and districts receiving the dollars. The provision ensures that those funds are supplemental and cannot take the place of state and local funds in Title I schools. Congress issued the provision as part of the statute to ensure that using Title I funds as a replacement did not happen. So districts are required to essentially use Title I funds on the top and to ensure that their state and local funds are not replaced. So they are required to carry out programs or services that in the absence of federal funds, using state funds, those programs and services would have to exist, sort of like a base layer of services they are required to provide. Previous supplement, not supplant provisions under NCLB were restrictive, so the provision under ESSA is an attempt to essentially lessen the burden of supplement, not supplant. If you'll remember, under NCLB, the provision required districts and schools to ensure that funds were supplemental on a case-by-case, expenditure-by-expenditure basis. And under ESSA, that is no longer the case. So that provision, the provision we're going to talk about, is laid out in Section 1118B of the ESSA. And we're going to give you some details on what you should be doing with that.
So here's an overview using some of the language that is in the Every Student Succeeds Act. And it requires an SEA or LEA to use Title I funds only to supplement the funds that would, in the absence of those Title I funds, be made available from state and local sources for the education of students participating in Title I programs and not to supplant such funds. So that language is found in Section 1118B1. And this requirement for funds to be supplemental, the requirement is largely unchanged from ESEA Section 1120A as amended by the NCLB. But the way that you show those funds are supplemental has changed.
So to demonstrate compliance with the requirement, districts are required to produce and use a methodology to allocate state and local funds. Essentially, districts have to show that the funds they distribute to schools, regardless of Title I status, are equitable. In addition to that, they have to ensure that their district level state and local fund services provided through those are provided in without regard to Title I status.
And so notice that the focus of the methodology has changed. The focus is now on the allocation of state and local funds, not on how Title I funds are being used. And then methodology also differs from supplement not supplant requirements of other ESEA programs, in which the focus remains on whether an activity supported with federal funds is supplemental.
So I think we need to make clear that this methodology approach applies to Title I only and not to other programs under ESSA. Some of the other programs that would not be affected are listed below. Title I Part C, Part D, Title II Part A, for example, have their own supplement not supplant provisions and are not connected in any way to the Title I Part A provision.
So let's go over some of the methodology requirements. And, we talked about these during the February meeting, so part of this is going to be review, but I think it's very appropriate to have an update and some reminders about this. Remember that the methodology must account for the distribution of state and local funds, including staff, resources, and services such as professional development, in a Title I neutral manner. It needs to include all state and local funds that the district uses for the education of students. It must reflect staffing and services allocations with real calculations and numbers to support it. So we don't want an example of what a district might do or could do, like a hypothetical example. We want to see how those allocations and how the staffing and services and resources are being distributed. And it's really based on the staffing allocation that districts already provide to KDE. So in addition to the staffing, we would want to see the other state and local funds and how those are being allocated as well. We also are asking for an accompanying narrative to explain, and we'll talk more about that narrative a little bit later. And then the last thing is that we would need to have the methodology supported with documentation, and that we'll go into more detail on that a little bit later as well.
So there may be some exceptions that apply to districts in part or as a whole regarding supplement not supplant under Title I Part A. These exceptions were issued in the finalized guidance USAID produced. So let's just go through those. Number one, if the LEA has only one school, for example, a K-8 school, or the LEA just has one K-12 school, that district would be exempt from the methodology requirement. If the LEA has only Title I schools and no non-Title I schools, again, in that case, the LEA would be exempt as a whole from that requirement. Or, finally, number 3 applies on a grade span by grade span basis. So if an LEA has a grade span that has only one school, for example, has only one middle school, for example, only non-Title I schools in that grade span, or only Title I schools in that grade span on a grade span by grade span basis, those grade spans would be exempt from the methodology requirement.
Right, and so let me check real quick to see if we have any questions. And David, I think we had talked about before that just because a district might be exempt from the methodology doesn't mean that it's exempt from other requirements.
Yeah, that's correct. Districts are held to all other requirements regardless if they apply, if this exemption applies, or if they were to apply for other waivers for other parts of the ESSA. So yes, all other parts of the program do apply.
Sure. Okay. We don't have any questions, so we'll go on to the next slide and talk about what districts need to include in the methodology. Again, a lot of this is probably going to be a reminder, but we are asking for districts to include, and again, this goes back to your required staffing allocation that districts are doing anyways, but the numbers of certified and classified staff to be allotted to each school that is required to have a methodology. So we need to see those actual numbers. Instructional funds to be allocated to each school, the allocation of other state and local funds. Show the allocation of staff and funds for each school with actual numbers again. It must be Title I neutral, and we're asking for it to be completed by September the 30th for each school year. And the reason for that is because we had said during the February meetings that if you wanted to use projected enrollment around March 1st for the next school year, that would be fine. If you're completing your methodology in August or September, you could use your current enrollment, your student enrollment. And since updated allocations are due to enrollment changes are due September 15th, according to 702 KAR 3246, we felt like if it's done by September 30th, that would be in line with that deadline for the staffing allocation. Remember, this is not required to be submitted to KDE, but it must be made available along with supporting documentation if your district is selected for monitoring. And we also would like a narrative to explain. And again, we will go into more detail on what's included in the narrative in our next slide.
So in the narrative, which would be particularly helpful to anybody outside who is auditing this particular requirement, we would want you to include a brief explanation of the staffing and funding sources that are included in the methodology. Explain how those funds were distributed. For example, if you have funds that are allocated on a rotational basis, maybe such as CATS funds, or combined and assigned through a per pupil amount, please explain that. Explain which year's enrollment is being used in the calculations if it's not clear within your calculation spreadsheets or whatever method you're using to provide secondary documentation of that narrative. And affirm that the funds and staff were distributed according to the methodology. In most cases, we think that the brunt of this work is going to be done up front with providing and producing that narrative, because we see a lot through monitoring that districts are using planning spreadsheets to calculate and distribute funds across schools, and those spreadsheets are in use annually for that purpose. So once you get that narrative written, essentially you're just replacing the spreadsheets that support that narrative year to year.
All right, so I'm going to go back one slide because there's something I forgot to tell you. There's a couple of other questions that are in the non-regulatory guidance that I want to bring your attention to. So I mentioned that if you could use your projected enrollment, March, April, May, etc. You could use your actual enrollment if you're doing your methodology later on, and we said we would like it to be completed by September 30th. There is a question in the guidance document that asks, they have question and answer, and they ask if districts have to adjust their allocation of state and local resources to account for changes during the school year. And the answer to that question is no. The district has to demonstrate compliance through the methodology at only one point during the year and is not required to continuously demonstrate compliance throughout the school year. There's another related question in that document that asks if last-minute changes before the start of school affect compliance of an LEA's methodology with the supplement not supplant requirement, and again that answer is no. As long as the methodology for allocating state and local funds is neutral with respect to Title I school status, last-minute changes in resource allocation that often occur prior to the beginning of the school year should not affect an LEA's compliance with the supplement not supplant requirements. And wanted to make sure that we're clear on that as well.
Can I add a couple things
Please.
to that, Tara?
Yes, absolutely.
So the guidance also states that the methodology cannot be based on an expenditure basis. So it has to be based on distribution, planning for the school year, and can't be documented by actual expenditures, which I thought was interesting as well. It also said that comparability, which is very closely related to the methodology, in most cases would not serve as documentation for the methodology. So just wanted to make sure that is clear for everybody.
Yeah, that's good to remember. All right, so let's talk now about verification. If your district is selected for monitoring, our Title I staff will request your written methodology with the narrative and evidence that the methodology was implemented and that the funds were distributed accordingly. So evidence could include, for example, schools' master schedules listing all staff, SBDM minutes, and there's probably other documentation as well that would help support that the methodology was implemented as it's shown.
This would be a place where our staff will probably have lots of questions, because we're going to need some explanation about certain things in the methodology that may be clear if you work at the district, but may not be as clear if we're coming in from the outside. So I would think that if we're on site or doing desk monitoring, we would probably have lots of questions for staff that work with the methodology.
And that's one reason why we were wanting the narrative to maybe help answer some of those questions on the front end, so we can understand what was actually done in the methodology. So yes, good information. Okay.
So what funds are subject to the supplement not supplant requirement? Well, it's essentially all state and local funds that the LE uses for the education of students. This includes any funds that are provided directly to schools, that may provide staffing, materials, technology, those things. It is, and USAID recognized that it is apparent that LEAs do not distribute all their funds to schools. There may be some state and local reservations, if you will, that districts take that are actually not subject to the compliance demonstration through the methodology. However, they go on to explain that those funds or services provided through those funds have to be distributed or provided without regard to a school's Title I status. So, for example, if a district reserves some funds and use those to provide some PD to schools, it could not provide those PD services to non-Title I schools, kind of disregarding the Title I schools because they get Title I funding, if you will.
All right, and so that concludes our information on supplement not supplant, and this is just a reminder for Project 310D. We've been sending out reminders to districts that have a balance in their Project 310D. All funds must be spent or encumbered by September 30th, 2019, and the final federal cash request must be submitted by December 6th, 2019. If you still have a positive balance in that project code, we will continue to send you some reminders, because we want to make sure that you get those funds spent down. And here are some resources for you. You can see that there's, again, a link to the Supplement Not Supplant Non-Regulatory Guidance. We put in a link to our district set-aside guidance. Title I newsletter also has some information about district set-asides. Again, the federal grants webpage is where you can find your federal grant award notifications, and then a link to our documents and resources page where you will find a lot of different guidance documents and resources. Now, next month, I hope you'll be able to join us, because we're going to have a great webinar next month. Jennifer Aiken will be here, and we'll be talking about internal controls and maybe give you a sneak peek as to some of the changes that we are contemplating for the monitoring checklist, and you'll get to have some information about that as well. So hopefully you'll be able to join us. We don't have any questions at this time, David, so thank you all for joining us for this month, and hope to see you next month as well.